This is chapter 1 titled Jazz Baby. Section is titled Frankie's Great Migration. My mother was a party lady. She used to tell me that while she was carrying me, she could feel me kicking in time to the beat when she was dancing. She said that when I was born and the doctor held me upside down and slapped me, I started crying like this. Uh, uh, uh. So I guess like a triple step sort of rhythm thing. So I guess I was just born with a rhythm. Lucille Hadley Manning gave birth to me on May 26, 1914, in Jacksonville, Florida. She was 15. She and my father, Jerry Jerome Manning, who was 10 years older, named me Frank Benjamin. Frank Jacksonville was a good-sized city even then, but Campbell Hill, the neighborhood where I spent my first 3 years, had a small-town feel. Our house, which was very modest, was on a dirt road and had 3 little bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and an outhouse. Of course, it was in a black section. This was 1914. My parents had one child before me, but she died when I was 2, so for all intents and purposes, I was an only child. They never spoke about it, but I think she came down with pneumonia. My parents separated in 1917 and eventually divorced. In 1936, my mother had a second son by another man who she never married. I was 22 when Vincent Manning was born, but I never got to know my half-brother well because of our age difference. Other than my sister's passing, I had a pretty happy childhood. My mother worked as a chambermaid, then a laundress in a white section of town, my father in a lumber mill. They didn't have a lot of money, but we got by. Grandmother Hadley lived next door. She took care of me and my 2 female cousins, who would watch over me as I went back and forth between the 2 houses. We often stayed overnight at our grandmother's, and she fixed all of our family meals, served up plenty of southern food. My father was a Methodist and my mother a Baptist. I rarely went to church with him, but I did attend her congregation, where she was a prominent member every Sunday. It was her preacher who baptized me in the St. John's River, ducking my head under the cold water. My mother's church used to put on what they called Tom Thumb weddings. I was always the groom, and this one little girl was usually the bride. My mother, who was a very good seamstress, made me a little tuxedo, and I would walk down the aisle in my little tie and tails to get married. Whenever I'd look over at my mother, she was beaming at me. When I was 3, my mother went to New York for an extended visit, leaving me in the care of my father and grandmother. She returned home about 6 months later, but left again immediately, this time taking me and her closest friend, Marie Robinson, Aunt Marie to me, who was like her sister, along. She just left my father like that. Evidently, it wasn't a happy marriage. I don't remember any fighting between them, but she wanted to go to New York, and I guess he wasn't ready to make that move. I think the main reason my mother came to New York was economic, but it was also because of a good friend of hers who worked as a cook for the Cunard Line, a very nice fellow named Robert Hightower. At the time, a lot of ships went back and forth between the South and the North. I think he persuaded her to leave Florida and helped us book passage for the trip up the coast. Eventually, she started going with him. I remember how he used to like to stare at the ocean through the ship's railing because the boat made waves as it passed through the water, and it seemed to me that the waves were making little patterns. It looked like one wave would deep underneath the next wave, then come up over the top of it, making a little circle. Then the waves would curl into each other. They looked like they were playing together, and I thought it was a heck of a game. I got so fascinated that I couldn't wait to run up on deck each day and see what the waves were doing. I used to say to myself, I'm going to learn the little game those waves are playing so I can teach it to the kids up in New York. I was engraving it in my mind so I could do my own interpretation of it. This section titled, New York, New York. New York took some getting used to. In the South, we had dirt roads, horses, wagons, and one-story houses. Here, the sidewalks were paved, and there were apartments with a whole gang of people living on top of each other. And I remember seeing a lot of uniformed soldiers walking around who had returned from fighting in World War I. Most of all, I was overwhelmed by the tall buildings. My apartment house was only 5 stories high, but that was huge to me. Everybody used to say, "You think this is tall? Wait until you see the Woolworth building." I used to walk around all the time with my head in the air, looking up. When we first got to New York, we rented 2 rooms in the apartment of this lady named Mrs. Brooks at 109 West 138th Street, between Lenox and 7th Avenues. My Aunt Marie rented a room in another apartment in the same building. The landlady had 2 sons, Kenneth and Eric, who were both a little older, so they kind of took me under their wing and showed me the ropes. It was still summer, so there were a lot of kids on the sidewalks playing hide and seek and shooting marbles and soda water bottle caps. At first, I just watched from our first floor window, but after a while I began to learn how to play the games and joined in. I didn't actually enter elementary school until a year or 2 after the other kids my age, because my mother didn't enroll me at that point. She and my aunt taught me my alphabet and numbers at home. I tried to learn quickly. I always wanted to please my mother. I studied even if they weren't around and learned my alphabet so well that I could say it backward. When I finally did go to school, I was given some tests to decide what level I should be in and put in first grade. Eventually, I was reunited with the other kids my age because they had me skip a level or two. I was a very good student, and spelling was one of my strong points. When the teacher asked for someone to spell a word, I'd be like, me, with my hand waving in the air. My mother was working downtown at a laundry on Lexington Avenue in the 60s or 70s when I first started school. Every morning at 7 o'clock, she would drop me off at PS 89 at West 135th Street and Lenox Avenue, then catch the subway at the corner. School didn't start until 8:30, but the hour and a half passed like crazy because we were playing handball. I was always the first kid there, so I got a court before the other kids came. They'd say, "Can we play on your court?" And I'd say, "Yeah, man, come on." When I got out of school at 3 o'clock, I would go across the street at the Lincoln Theater on West 135th Street, just east of Lenox Avenue. My mother had a friend who worked there as an usher, and this lady would let me go into the theater to watch the show for a couple of hours until my mother came to get me. This was a vaudeville theater. I'm pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that right. There was a movie following the stage show, with the whole thing repeated 4 times a day. Since I went every day, I saw the same program over and over and had the opportunity to watch a lot of famous performers, like Burt Williams, Bill Robinson, Paul Robeson, Eddie Rector, the Whitman sisters, and Noble Sissel. I was actually more drawn to the comedians than the dancers, but the funny thing is that most of the comedians did a comic dance routine. Of course, sometimes I would just sit and do my homework by the light coming from the hallway and the projectionist's booth. In 4th or 5th grade, I got transferred out of PS 89 to PS 5, which was located at West 140th Street and Edgecombe Avenue. I actually lived closer to PS 89, but the Board of Education realized that my address was not in that school district. PS 5 was the opposite direction from the subway, and too far from the Lincoln Theater for me to walk to by myself. So my mother came up with another plan. While she continued to live in our apartment, she paid for me to board just up the block with Mrs. Johnson, an elderly, heavy-set widow who was a friend of the Lincoln Theater usher. My mother thought it would be better for me to not be living with her anyway, because she was always working and, partying, not every single night, mostly on the weekends. But this was grown folks partying. A little later, my mother and Aunt Marie moved down to West 121st Street into a brownstone that gave them a bit more privacy. I continued to live with Mrs. Johnson so that I could finish up at PS5 and not change schools again. When she died suddenly 6 months later, I moved in with her friend and next-door neighbor, Mrs. Lawson, and stayed with her until I graduated from PS5. People sometimes ask me if I felt abandoned by my mother, but I never did. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Lawson were like mothers to me. They treated me as if I was their child, and my mother used to come around a lot. Most days she would stop over on her way home from work to see if there was anything we needed, and I could also go visit her whenever I wanted to. So I didn't really feel neglected in any way. I guess I was just too busy with other people, with other kids. Section is called Summertime. For several summers after we moved to New York, my mother sent me to my aunt, my father's sister, and Uncle Gowdy's farm in Aiken, South Carolina. She wanted me to get to know my cousins and spend time with my father and grandmother Hadley, her mother, who had moved there when my parents separated. They were both from South Carolina originally, although I believe my father had some Cherokee blood. My mother had been born in West Palm Beach. Each visit south lasted 4 to 6 weeks. I traveled alone by train, always in a separate coach for blacks because the railroad was segregated then. My mother would attach a tag to my clothing with my name, address, and destination so the conductor, who she asked to look after me, would know when to put me off the train. She tipped him and gave me $1 in case I wanted to buy something to eat. It was fascinating to be on the farm. Just about everything we ate was grown there. We had this long table covered with all different kinds of food like fresh corn, peas, rice, hot biscuits, and cornbread. Whatever meat there was, like pig's feet or cow, came from the farm. I must have been pretty young the first time I went because I couldn't reach the table. So they got a very thick Bible for me to sit on. During the growing season, my aunt and uncle hired workers to help in the fields. They lived on the farm and I used to play with some of their kids. We liked going into fields and eating watermelon and green peanuts until we got sick, and had a lot of fun playing games like hide and seek. My mother put a swing on the limb of this gigantic oak tree in our front yard, and all the kids in the area used to come over to swing on it with me. We worked in a factory where they made barrels for beer, pickles, and other items, so sometimes I'd take a shortcut through this wooded area to bring him his lunch pail. then wait until the workday was over to walk back to the farm with him. My earliest musical memory, this is even before I went to house rent parties, was in Aiken when my family would sit outside on the porch or in our front yard in the evening after the week's work was finished. The farm hands would sometimes gather there to play music, maybe on a washtub bass and harmonica, and sometimes a friend of my father's would come over and play banjo with them. The musicians would stand in a circle, and people would get up and dance in the middle. They'd take turns getting out there, just improvising, do whatever they felt like doing. An older person might pull a child in, but the kids mostly jumped up and down. I never wanted to participate, but after my grandmother would push me into the circle, you couldn't get me to stop. I'd always try to copy what I saw the grown-ups doing. On Sundays, and occasionally other evenings, I also remember hearing all of this singing and shouting coming from across the river that ran in front of our house. There was a church tent over there with revival meetings going on inside. Even though they didn't have microphones, it wasn't that far away and it was loud, so we could hear the preacher preaching and the people clapping their hands, shaking tambourines, and singing all this fantastic gospel music. In most Baptist churches, when the preacher's getting deep down and he's talking to the sisters and brothers, they start carrying on and sometimes you'll see somebody jump up. But in revival meetings, the Holy Rollers do that constantly. They carry on, shout, by this I mean a movement where they clench their fists, then throw their arms in the air, and go into all kinds of contortions as if they're possessed by the Spirit and they want to let it go, baby. That's the feeling these people had, and it was very inspiring. On the farm, the grown-ups would be rocking to the music from the tent, and to entertain themselves, the kids would recreate what was happening inside. We'd imitate the preaching, singing, shouting, and carrying on of the Holy Rollers, just cutting up. That music and the movements we did were so exhilarating that they kind of stuck with me from then on. Even as I got older, I remembered those rhythms very clearly. Although my grandmother lived in Aiken, she had a lot to say about my upbringing. Kids in the South were taught to respect their elders as a way of life, but things were different up north. When I first moved to New York, I would hear our landlady tell her kids, "I told you to do so-and-so." They'd answer, "Oh, Ma, we'll do it when we're finished." When my mother said now, she meant now, not when you get ready. I never talked back to her. If my mother got mad at me, she'd chastise me, but when my grandmother got angry with me, she'd whoop me. Once we were eating at the table, and I put some butter on my plate, even though I didn't want any. Instead of saying, "Grandmother, I don't want the butter," I smeared it on the wall. I guess I was thinking that she might tell me to eat it because it's good for you, and I didn't want to hear that. She whooped me for not saying I didn't want the butter, and for spreading it on the wall. Afterwards, when I was crying, she hugged me and said, "You know that I love you, but when you do something bad, you're going to get punished." I didn't get angry though. She was strict, but she was fair. And afterwards, she'd bake me a sweet potato pie. Although racism existed in the North, Aiken was the first place where I experienced it outright. My older cousin and I had driven into town on a horse and wagon to do some errands and were walking on a narrow sidewalk when we noticed 3 young white men coming toward us. As we approached, it didn't seem like they were going to move, and just when we got up to them, my cousin took my hand and pulled me into the street. I could hear those boys laughing as we walked by. Afterwards, my cousin didn't say anything, and I didn't think about it. It wasn't until much later that I wondered why the hell we had to stop off the curb. Eventually, I understood that they had the right-of-way because they had more rights than we did, but that wasn't the way I saw it at the time. Another time, also in Aiken, I helped this white fellow load his wagon in exchange for a ride back to my aunt's farm. When I went to sit on the seat next to him, he told me I had to go to the back of the wagon. This time, I knew why. They had signs down there saying colored and white on fountains and restaurants, which was strange to me. I was very young, and if that went on in New York, I didn't know much about it. However, as I grew older, I saw plenty of examples of prejudice up north. For instance, I found that there was at least one restaurant on 125th Street, right in the middle of Harlem, that blacks couldn't enter. We could go into Woolworth's and buy whatever we wanted, but we couldn't sit down and eat at the counter. And although 125th Street was right in the middle of this black neighborhood, the stores along it didn't hire African Americans. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. said if they won't hire blacks, then we won't buy anything. In the late 30s, he picketed and organized demonstrations against the stores until he agreed to start hiring some blacks. I can tell you about stuff that happened even in the 1970s. I was driving on Long Island near Riverhead when I stopped at a roadside confectionery store to get something to drink. There were 2 white fellows inside. Before I could even order anything, the counterman said, "Look, you better get out of here because I don't want any trouble." I said, "I just want a bottle of soda." But he said, "You better go ahead." I didn't want to have a problem, so I turned around, walked out, and drove away. Things like that happens up north too. Competitive edge. As I got a little older, I began to participate more in all of the street activities going on in my neighborhood in Harlem. By about age 7, one of my favorite games was our version of Follow the Leader, which we played on construction sites because they weren't boarded up then like they are now. Any kid who couldn't run along the exposed beams or climb the building's frame was considered chicken. There were two groups in the neighborhood, the Boy Scouts in their uniforms, hats, and badges, and us poor kids in our raggedy pants and worn out sneakers. Since we couldn't be Boy Scouts, we said that they weren't any good. Even though those goody-goodies were supposed to be so great at sports and could afford special camps, we trained in street ways and were always trying to beat them in everything. And we did, a lot. Anyway, they were Boy Scouts and had to follow the commands of their leader as if they were in the army. But we were just free and could do anything we wanted to, except when our mothers told us not to. Sports were very important to me, and if I didn't have the winning edge, I would practice until I did, or at least until I improved. When I played stickball, which was the most popular game on the street, we would have teams, say 138th Street against 137th Street, and if you wanted to play, you had to get picked. Naturally, they picked the best ones, so of course I wanted to be the best. Now I could hit the ball and I could run, but I wasn't much at catching. I just couldn't close my hands quickly enough. I knew it was one of my weaknesses, so I used to spend hours by myself throwing the ball against the wall and catching it, practicing and practicing until I got better. We also had a lot of races out on the street. I was considered a pretty good runner, so one day I challenged this fellow who was on the senior high school track team to a race from one manhole to the next. Even though I was pretty swift at getting off the mark, Mason shot out of there and beat me. Right away, I started making excuses about how I didn't get a good start and suggested that we race again. I ran as hard as I could, but this cat also won the second race. After he won the third time, I stopped giving excuses. Instead, I said to myself, okay, I did the best I could, and maybe someday I'll be able to run that fast. In order to improve, I got lots of tips from the coaches and some of the older kids, and of course, I practice, and practice. It was in junior high school that I also got into boxing. We would have little matches to see who could outbox each other, but we were real street fighters. After high school, I spent a brief period of time training with an ex-prized fighter who offered to work with me because he thought I showed promise. Since I was always trying to box some cat who was older than me, I got beat up a lot, but I learned a lot too. At that period of time, it was rough out there on the streets, and when you showed that you weren't afraid, guys respected you more. I liked knowing how to take care of myself. When I was about 10 or 11, shortly after I started living with my mother again on West 121st Street, we moved around the corner to West 122nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenues. Some kids on the block warned me about Butch, the neighborhood bully, but being the new kid, I soon became his favorite victim. One afternoon, after I had just bought a box of chocolate snaps at the grocery store, Butch came over and said, "Give me those chocolates." I told him I wouldn't, so he said, "If you don't, I'm going to beat your butt," and grabbed them from me. I started begging him to give them back, but he kept pushing me away and I wouldn't fight. At that moment, my mother came walking down the street on her way home from work. I ran to her with tears in my eyes, hoping that this would win her sympathy and that maybe she'd get in there and grab the cookies. Instead, she said, "He took your chocolate snaps from you, right? Well, he can keep them if you don't want to take them back." Right then and there, I decided I'd rather fight Butch than have my mother be mad at me. I turned slowly and walked toward him, looking back at her every few steps. Just as Butch was about to eat the first cookie, I grabbed the box from him. He was very surprised and threatened to beat my backside again, but after a stern glance from my mother, I raised my fists and threw a punch. We hit each other a few times before Butch finally said, "Keep the chocolate snaps, I don't want them anyway," and stomped off. When I went back to my mother and said, "Look, Mommy, I got them back," she replied, "See, if you don't stand up to people, they'll take advantage of you. I didn't say you could beat him, maybe he would have beat you, but from now on he's going to respect you." I learned a lesson from that incident. Although I would fight if I had to, from an early age, I prefer to take care of tense situations without getting physical, if possible. For instance, some of my friends used to try to talk me into sneaking into the movie theater, which I didn't want to do, because I didn't want my mother to find out. When I'd say no, they'd call me a sissy, but I'd just brush them off, saying, "Okay, I'm a sissy, but don't introduce me to your sister." They didn't have too much to say after that. Stoops and roofs. Occasionally, my fascination with physical challenges got me into hot water. All of us kids used to hop the trolleys running up and down Lenox Avenue without paying the fare. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway because it was so much fun. Once, when I climbed onto the rear of a moving car, this white passenger yelled at me and slapped my face. He didn't call me names, but he socked the hell out of me. Man, did my cheek burn. I wasn't sure if it was because I was black or because I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing. Whatever it was, I jumped right down and never did it again. Another thing I loved doing was leaping over the storage basement doors that alternated with apartment stoops along Lenox Avenue. I'd get a running start, then vault from one stoop to another, flying over the open hatch in between. One time I didn't quite make it. The front of my foot got caught, and as I fell I scraped my shin against the sharp edge of the iron door. The skin along my lower leg peeled back like a banana, and blood started gushing out. Harlem Hospital was a couple of blocks away, so I ran there. As soon as this nurse saw me with this flap on my leg and goopy blood all over my feet, she threw me on a gurney and rushed me into the emergency room, where they wrapped a tourniquet around my thigh to stop the bleeding. It's funny, but the whole time they were washing it out and sewing me up, wow. The only thing I could think of was, are they going to tell my mother? Of course, I had to tell her when I got home and she saw this big bandage. A couple of years after that incident, this group of kids and I discovered a new playground, the roof. Rooftops on tenement buildings in New York City were generally 5 or 6 stories high and were often separated at the rear by air shafts that provided apartments with additional windows. Folks would string their laundry from window to window and gossip with their neighbors across these air shafts. My friends and I came up with a stunt that was inspired by this setup. We used to put a board up to the raised edge of one roof, run up the board, and jump across the open space to the opposite roof. One day, one of the fellows didn't quite make it. He fell 5 floors, but since his fall was kind of broken by the clotheslines, he only broke both of his legs. We tried to run down the stairs to get him, but the door to that particular apartment building was locked from the inside. So we actually jumped back over to the other side, opened the door, and ran down. Apparently, we weren't so scared that we couldn't make the jump again, so we could go help him. Again, this was something I had to tell my mother. She said, "I don't want you on that roof anymore." "Yes, Mommy," as if that was going to stop me. One Christmas season, when I was 9 or 10, I went into the Woolworths on 125th Street to buy a box of candy for my mother with money I had earned by doing chores for elderly people around the neighborhood. I had been saving to get this gift, and I had just enough money. While I was looking around, I noticed some very small toy automobiles in shiny colors and got the bright idea that I can slip one into my hand and walk right on out of the store, which is what I started to do. When I got to the door, this security guard, a white fellow dressed in street clothes, stopped me and said gruffly, "Hey kid, open your hand. I saw you taking that toy." I was terrified. "I'll put it back," I stammered. "I'll put it back. I didn't mean to take it." But he said, "I've got to punish you and take you to jail." "You can take me to jail," I pleaded, "but please don't tell my mother." Instead, he took me downstairs to the basement, which was filled with boxes, and said, "I want you to clean up this room. Stay here until I come back for you." I told him I'd do anything as long as he didn't tell my mother, and began putting the boxes in order and sweeping up the room. The whole time, the thought of my mother trusting me so much that I let her down was killing me inside. It might not have been that long, but after what seemed like a couple of hours, the man came back. He looked around and said, "You cleaned the place and it looks very nice." I asked him if there was anything else he wanted me to do, but he told me to go on upstairs. As I was leaving, he asked me why I had come into the store in the first place. When I told him, he went behind the counter and came back with a box of candy. "Give this to your mother," he said, "and I don't want to see you in the store anymore." I took the box and ran all the way home. The only thing I told my mother was that I cleaned this guy's basement and he gave me a box of candy. It was the first and last time I tried stealing. If you hear me say, "Mother, mother, mother," all the time, it's only because after my parents separated, I stayed with her. She was always the one who was there. My father eventually moved to New York around my 10th birthday. After that, my mother stopped sending me to South Carolina for the summers. Instead, for the next couple of years, she enrolled me in a day camp run by a Bisnean Baptist church with activities such as arts, crafts, and sports. I especially loved the field trips to Orchard Beach in the Bronx, and the lemonade and cake parties that my counselor and her husband had for her campers in the backyard of their brownstone. I saw a lot more of my father once he came up north. He worked as a manual laborer for several years, then ran a newsstand in Harlem. On his day off, we'd often go sightseeing, walk through Central Park, and stop in at the zoo, or visit his brother, a music teacher who lived on West 99th Street. This period lasted from about age 10 until 15. After that, I didn't see him as often because by then, I had developed other interests.